Sorby Bridge Chapel in 1731 of John Sharp. I put Jack in brackets because that's how he was known, how he was always referred to by his cousin Caroline Walker in her diary. So this was the old chapel right down by the bridge at Sorby Bridge. You can see it there, right down by the river. It used to get flooded sometimes, and that was demolished in the early 19th century and Christ Church built further up. So the father of Jack Sharp, he died when he was small. So John Walker of Walterclough, the older of the John Walkers, took in this nephew and raised the boy as though he was one of his own, and gave him many favours which seem to have been really perhaps more than his own children. And the lad accepted all these favours without any gratitude whatever. He took everything that was given to him and ran with it, and didn't really relate to other members of his family, his cousins, who had more right to the property. The image on the left is another sketch by Arthur Comfort of the kitchen at Walterclough as it was about 1920. Found this quite by accident recently. Some lovely images of this old building, which of course, like so many others, we have now lost. So in effect, what Jack Sharp did was he took over the running and the ownership of his uncle's house and his uncle's business, which was like a manufacturer. We'd say a manufacturer who sold his pieces in the Peace Hall. And this was Caroline Walker's grandfather. So Caroline, who wrote about him early in the 19th century, had these stories handed down to her by her father's generation. She hadn't, I don't think, known him directly. In due course, John Walker Sr. retired from keeping his business up at Walterclough, and he moved into Halifax. And about the time that the old square, the red brick square, was built just to the north of the Peace Hall, before the Peace Hall was built, and those houses, wonderfully ornate terraced houses of brick, survived until 1959. And this is where Mr. Walker moved in, whether it was to get away from what Jack Sharp was doing up at the hall, we don't know. This is the newer building at Walterclough in great decline. It had all gone, I gather, by about 1980, if not before. So following his uncle's departure to live in Halifax in 1758, it appears as though Jack Sharp acted as owner of the house at Walterclough and the business that was operating there. Meanwhile, 10 years later, John Walker Sr. died in Halifax. And thereafter, Jack Sharp seems to have kept the business at Walterclough going, and he did pretty well in business. In 1759, at Halifax Parish Church, he married a girl called Jane Nichol, and this is a signature, John Sharp there. You can see it, the signature, and some people would have us believe that this is Jack Sharp, who was one of the inspirations for Heathcliff. In 1766, the parish church at Halifax had a new organ built, and this was built by public subscription, which meant the wealthy of the parish would pay for it. And there are accounts which still tell us how much they paid. And Jack Sharp, as well as his uncle John Walker Sr., both contributed towards this organ, which indicates they were both men of considerable means at the time. I'm paraphrasing what we know about Jack Sharp's life to just tell you what might be of interest. At the baptism of his youngest daughter, which took place at Southowram Chapel, the old chapel, in 1771, there was evidently a great Walker and Sharp family reunion or gathering. And at that time it seems as though the younger Walkers, who had been apparently dispossessed of their home at Walterclough, were just content to allow Jack Sharp to live at Walterclough and run his business there. However, in 1771, later that same year, the younger John Walker, who was the real heir to Walterclough, got married. He married Elizabeth Waddington up at Thirsk, and he wanted his property at Walterclough back from Jack Sharp. He said, "You've got no right to it, this is my inheritance, but Jack wouldn't really listen. He had no claim to Walter Clough in law, but he'd taken it over and used it as his own. This is St Mary's Church at Thirsk, where John Walker, who was the father of Caroline Walker, who gave us the diary and the account of Jack Sharp, was married in 1772. Instructions very strictly given after this marriage that Jack should leave the house. Eventually, and most reluctantly, Jack Sharp moved out, and he had a bit of land of his own, which was at a situation called Mount Pleasant on the road through Southowram, and he built Law Hill House and its adjacent wool warehouse, from which he himself ran his woolen business. And we know he was very successful there. So Law Hill House that we see today was built by Jack Sharp. Before leaving Walter Clough, though, Jack Sharp was very, very mean. He deliberately left Walter Clough, all the property there, in a terrible state. He left it sort of vandalised and damaged. That's just a general picture of damage. So he was not a very happy bunny leaving his house and having to build a new one himself, which is only, as we will gather, half a mile away perhaps less. So there we're coming back to what we saw earlier, the former warehouse. And this is where Jack Sharp would have operated his business from. And he would even export some of his woolens across the North Atlantic to America. And he had quite a prosperous business exporting. And this is the building, of course, which brings us back to Miss Patchett's school. But back to Jack Sharp. He was very, very prosperous. He did really well. Meanwhile, his cousin, John Walker Younger, was doing pretty well himself back at Walter Clough. But Jack Sharp got into bad company, and he started spending too much time gambling with card players and heavy drinking. Sounds almost like Emily Brontë, doesn't it? There were two of his former apprentices who he trained in the business, who presumably had their own business by now. Anyway, they were still around, and they were called Landford and Yates, and he spent a lot of time carousing with them. And it didn't do him much good, and of course he was frittering away a bit of money there, wasn't he? He got into a bad financial mess, and twice, at great expense to himself, his cousin John Walker Jr., still at Walter Clough, stepped in and settled the large debts of Jack Sharp, which is an extraordinarily generous thing to do when this is a chap who's already tried to kid you out of your own property, and he's saving you from bankruptcy twice. However, things never quite recovered, and what it was which sunk Jack Sharp eventually was the American Revolutionary War. I mentioned that Jack had been exporting across the Atlantic some of his fabrics and so on, and of course with the closure of that business in the later 1770s, the export ceased, and that was where most of his money came from, and therefore he became a debtor, and he had to mortgage Law Hill House. This entry shows the baptism of Sam Stead at Halifax Parish Church in 1760. Another lad whose father died when he was very young. Jack Sharp at Law Hill House took in this cousin of his, who's sort of like a second cousin once removed, I think, took him in and, we're told, systematically debauched him. This all comes from Caroline Walker's writings. And Caroline also tells us that Jack similarly ruined the life of her own brother, who was John Walker III, really, and he died young and never got married. But they all really entered into a situation where they were no longer in control of themselves, no longer had their own property, and they ended up badly. So back to Jack Sharp. His corrupted relative Sam Stead, who he'd taken in when he was a boy, then tried to influence other children badly, and it sort of snowballed. So Jack Sharp, you might say, was a thoroughly bad lot. By the late 1770s, while Jack was in a lot of turmoil and trouble, suddenly his eldest daughter Nancy arrived back from London, pregnant without any prospect of marriage, which was of course a bit embarrassing in those days. Jack wasn't sure quite what to do, whether it was a result of this or for some other reason. He decided himself to go up to London and to live there. And he did in due course, and he was followed shortly afterwards by the rest of his family. As far as I know, his death has not been traced, but we can tell from a deed which dates 1798 that when his wife was still alive and he was declared dead, that he was no longer living then. So I'll just read this out then. Jack Sharp's gaining control of property not legally his and effectively disinheriting members of the Walker family of Walter Clough has led various Brontë researchers to conclude that his actions resembled those of the adult Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. It is certainly likely, but not certain, I should say, Emily would have heard of the negative actions of Jack Sharp when she was teaching at Law Hill, which of course was a house which had been built by him. This is a pedigree of the main Wuthering Heights families. It may mean nothing to you, and it is a bit artificial because the dates themselves that people have put in, I think, are imaginary in any case. But you may recall that Heathcliff took over the property of a lad called Hareton Earnshaw, who was regarded as not quite the brightest cutlery, shall we say. And we have here the Earnshaws and the Lintons, and of course Heathcliff, who wasn't entitled to the property at Wuthering Heights. Eventually, of course, he died, we know, and others took over. These are some of the old barns which stood, oh sorry about that, I've touched something that I shouldn't there. I've heard that, lots of people have said that to you, haven't they? I've touched something I shouldn't there. Anyway, we're talking about naughty people and naughty things, so it's rather appropriate I say that. Sorry about that. Be that as it may then, back to the barns. I don't know whether these mills here, they're like sort of barns, but not quite barns. And they're more like mills, small early mills of the industrial age from the early 19th century, when Caroline would have been living there, her father too. And her father continued running a successful business there at Walter Clough well into the 19th century, although his only son had really gone downhill and eventually died before he did. So John Walker at Walter Clough, the second of the family, he died in 1828, and his daughter Caroline, who gave us the story of her relative Jack Sharp, died in 1831, not very much later. And this family were buried underneath the chancel at the 1819 Church of St Anne at Southowram. That's the burial entry for Caroline. And if you look carefully, it says, in vault under chancel, which is really helpful. Her debauched brother had already died in his father's lifetime in 1818. Her three sisters, Delia, Georgiana and Marianne, lovely names, survived her. But this was the end of the Walker family effectively at Walter Clough. And 1854, coincidentally, saw the extinction of two branches of the Walker family. One was the last of Caroline's sisters, Delia, who died at Walter Clough and was buried at Southowram in October 1854, and her distant cousin, who was of course Anne Lister's friend, Anne Walker, who was of Crow Nest and Cliff Hill, died at Cliff Hill and was buried at Lightcliff in March that same year. So that was the end of two families. The males of the family had already died out. Those were the last of the females. And this photo shows the dilapidated condition of the remaining outbuildings at Walter Clough by the 1970s. They all went, as I said, by about 1980. Before we conclude, one or two more things to say. In the churchyard at Halifax Parish Church, Minster, I discovered this little inscription on a tombstone, and it tells us of a family called Bentley, who were living strictly at Law Hill in Southowram, presumably in the house by 1796. So little things like that you pick up on. I pick them up and I put them in somewhere, and nobody ever remembers them again. Finally, Miss Patchett gets married. Emily's schoolmistress, Emily's boss. We don't have any portrait of her which survives. We have a few anecdotes of her, and one in particular from Anne Lister's diary. Miss Patchett went around the gentry or the people who had a bit of money in the area soliciting funds for a new national school to be built at Southowram. And this is recorded in Anne Lister's journal in March 1837. And the national schools were the schools which were sponsored by the Church of England, and one was to be built opposite on the other side of the road of St Anne's Church at Southowram. It's still there today, and you can see it looks like this. It's been altered a bit, has an inscription on it, and it was opened in 1839. And Miss Patchett got some money from Anne Lister and Anne Walker for that building. Right, here is the Reverend John Hope, who was the vicar, curate, you might say strictly, at that church, St Anne's in Southowram. He was a Scotsman from Dumfriesshire. He was widowed in 1841, and he went on to marry Elizabeth Patchett as his second wife. So she then became Mrs. Hope, and this is their marriage entry at Halifax Parish Church in 1842. John Hope and Elizabeth Patchett, you don't give their ages, of full age. You just say that, don't you? And you can see there, they were married by Charles Musgrave, so well known in Halifax as the vicar and the archdeacon in the 19th century. Married 1842. And although they're not in the hands of the church now, they're in safekeeping, there are some silver communion items which were actually given by the former Elizabeth Patchett to the church of St Anne at Southowram in memory of her husband, who had been the vicar. And he died just a few years later. She was left a widow for quite a period of time. This is Southowram churchyard, St Anne's, with the monumental inscription to Elizabeth Patchett, who had been Emily's boss. She is buried, of course, in the Hope vault, because at the time she got married, she became a Hope. And the Hope vault who's married is indicated by the cross we see in the sunlight over the far side. It's near what used to be the vicarage garden wall to the right in front of the church. And Miss Patchett went on to live to be a very old lady. She didn't die until 1878. There's the monumental inscription, and there is the fact given here that later in her life she lived in Brighouse. So after her husband died, presumably she retired, she had no children of her own, and she went to live in Brighouse. And we're told by somebody who had an anecdote of Miss Patchett early in the 20th century, who remembered her as an old lady, but although she was very elderly, she could walk easily, she was very fit. Maybe it was all that horse riding in her youth. Curiously, when we can identify somebody's baptism or birth, we discover that her age at death was given wrong, both in the burial register and on the inscription, because we know she was buried she was born at the end of 1789, and she died and was buried in July 1878. So I think that makes her 88 rather than 89. And Nikki, wherever you are, here is the happy day back in 2018 when we unveiled the plaque to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Emily Bronte's birth on that wall outside Law Hill House. Of course, there was already another inscription nearby, but Halifax Civic Trust wanted to put their own, and it was a very happy day when the then mayor and mayoress came along, and we were all pictured. I was only there as the deputy, he was the full mayor. Well, we have this lovely account of a little girl who had the first name of Brontë. Some of you will know probably who she is. This was 2018, she's probably almost left school by now. And she was Brontë Graham. So that's the story of the unveiling of the plaque at Lower Hill House 7 years ago. So was the old house at High Sunderland, and do have a look at the model before you go if you haven't yet, was it in Emily's mind when she was deciding to write the story of Wuthering Heights? Could it be that some of the aspects, and you go back to the original book, look through it, read the description, see what you think. Did she use the story of Jack Sharp as related possibly to her, similarly to Caroline Walker? Did she use that character to help her create a person called Heathcliff? It's probable that both of these questions can never be answered conclusively. But there's a good deal of circumstantial evidence in both directions. Circumstantial evidence, however, is not proof. There are those who believe such concepts very firmly indeed. And so that brings us to the end, and thank you all very much. I've drawn on a vast number of resources from the Halifax Courier, various biographies, lots of old registers and things. Credit a lot of them here, there's probably loads of others. I hope you found that of some interest. Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and I hope I may see you somewhere else in future.